Father's Day, 1992.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
One day before his 27th birthday.
Kidding me.
Nobody deserves to have that disease.
Oh, good gosh, no.
But the 4.5 years we had from the time he told us he had AIDS until the day he died were the best 4.5 years we had as a family. We literally went for broke because we just knew we didn't have long.
Made the most of that time.
I think it was so courageous. There were a couple of times in those 4.5 years that he got depressed, and that depression would last 3 or 4 hours. And he'd be back to where he was. He was a manager, executive assistant and manager at a Walgreens drugstore in North Houston, and doubled their profit and doubled their sales in a couple of years that he was there. He just worked and worked, had a great work ethic. Great
Is he
kid.
a man of faith like you?
Somewhat, yeah.
Good, good. All right, you guys ready? Tunbridge,
Yes.
it's great to have you today. I want to take you back to your memories of the days maybe just prior to April 3rd of 1974. Where were you and what were you doing during those days?
I was a bivocational Baptist minister. I was the pastor at Cold Spring Baptist Church in Battletown and worked for the Meade County Messenger. There had been a tornado a few days before the April 3rd tornado that came through the county, and kind of gets your attention.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah, and in fact, we were going to mention that a little bit. If you want to talk about what happened on April 1st.
I don't remember much of that. I know it went through Midway and maybe touched the meat packing plant down there, but yeah, I was born and raised in Monticello, Indiana, or thereabouts on a farm. So we were familiar with, in that flat land, in that prairie, we were familiar with tornadoes and what to do. And so on the day of April the 3rd, when I saw the sky the color of green that it was, I knew there was in my world, that meant there's a tornado somewhere close.
Right. And it does come with some irony that you mentioned Monticello, which was also very hard hit that day.
It took out a section of a railroad bridge. There were a van full of some special needs students, as I recall, and they were all killed in that. And
yeah, that was rough.
Did some minor damage to my grandparents' home up there, so it was rough.
It was rough. It was a rough day for a lot of folks. I think sometimes you can lose focus when you're hit by something like Brandenburg was. But you guys were not alone, of course.
No.
All right, so I want your specific memory from April 3rd. What do you remember from the weather that day prior to the tornado?
I was on the way back from Elizabethtown. We had printed the newspapers down there, and part of my job, was to deliver papers throughout the county to the various newsstands and grocery stores, and so I had made several stops and got back to the Messenger and took the large canvas bags of newspapers to the post office so they could be mailed. And I went to the dock there at the post office and talked to Mr. Owen Dugan and Mr. Dick Muth and explained to them, fellas, when this sky is this color, there's a tornado close. We should take cover. And they said, that's exactly what we're going to do as soon as we can. And we chatted just for a minute or two, and as they said, as I drove away from the dock at the post office, it blew the windows out of the front of the post office. So I left the post office, which it was the old post office, and turned to go back downtown. The Messenger was downtown then at that time. And as I turned the corner to go downtown, a large sign, it looked like the RECC sign, went over the road in front of me.
Wow.
So I knew it got my attention. And so I turned there at the Moose Lodge and went in behind the Moose Lodge to a kind of a little block wall, and where we parked the pickup truck, and thought I'd better see what I can do. So I started to get out of the truck and looked up and saw trees, gable ends of houses, debris in the air, and stuff was already starting to move. So I thought, well, best thing for me to do is stay in the truck. So I laid down in the seat, got under the dash as much as I could. It picked the truck up and moved it a little. And at one point I looked up and saw the bottom end of one of the doors at the county garage coming right toward the windshield. So
Wow.
Yeah, it didn't take long to put my head back down. But you know, when something like that happens, you kind of go into a time warp. It's like every second seems like an eternity. And when it finished, when it stopped, I got out of the truck and tripped over concrete blocks. They were scattered all over the area. Twigs had made holes in the metal topper on the back of the truck, right behind the cab. Went to the Messenger to make sure that the Willises who owned the paper and their employees, make sure everyone was okay. And then went out on the street, and of course there was debris everywhere. And Ackley Harned, who was a pharmacist up in the Naser and Cole Clinic, or kind of the backside of the clinic, but Ackley Harned came by and he said, "Tom, let's go see if we can find someone." And we walked down to Rose Grinnell's store. Rose Grinnell she was in her 80s, had a 2-story dry goods store. She lived in the upstairs, and it was just a quaint, wonderful, we call it vintage clothing, but it was just a great place to go. And anyway, went in there. We had a tunnel. Ackley was smaller than me, so he would hand me boards and material, and we just built a tunnel and found her. We could hear her crying and screaming, and we got under there and found her. She was trapped, not hurt badly, but we had to then get her to crawl out.
Wow.
And so it was, the more she crawled, the more upset she became, and so it was difficult to get her out. We did get her out, and 4 men came by with a sheet of plywood and laid her on the plywood and carried her up to the clinic to be examined. One of those men I remember was Mr. Tony Brown. I don't remember the others. I probably knew them. And that's just about the way the rest of the day went. Little Dave's Tavern, the only thing left was the bar, and there was a young lady there, probably not much more than 20 years old, with a baby. They were covered in mud and debris, and their eyes were as big as saucers, and the baby was clearly in shock. She was trying to feed the baby a bottle. The bottle was just covered in mud. They were covered in mud, and talked to her and got her up to the clinic as well, got her up that way. That's the rest of the day went that way. And as tragic as it sounds, it was worse in reality. The area was not recognizable. The concern was just, let's find people. We were concerned about whether the electric lines were still alive, hot, to avoid all those. But several people were carried on doors and plywood up to the Naser and Cole Clinic to be examined. You got to think about 50 years ago, there were no cell phones, there was no communication, and what communication lines we had were down. The electric lines were down. No way to call people to let them know you were okay. No way to check on anyone else. But it becomes a blur, and I had a part in the memorial service a few days after that. But we spent our days. You had to prove to the state troopers that you either lived or worked in town to get back in town to get access. But we spent our days helping people try to recover what material we could from their homes. Wasn't a lot left.
Yeah. Wow.
The memorial service, quite frankly, the news media was somewhat of a problem. They were in there with their cameras and their lights, and here were all these caskets and families grieving, and they would go up and put their cameras right in a mother's face while she's looking over the casket. And it was not the best of circumstance, and very distasteful. I honestly thought some of the families became so agitated and so angry that I honestly thought there was going to be a riot when all that was going on. Those of us that were responsible for someone who had passed away, ministers, sat on the stage, and we each had a little part in the memorial service. And I sat in the back part of it, maybe the back row, and as the service started, the Catholic priest, and I don't recall his name, got up and he started reading from John 14. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many mansions. The lights go off. The cameras, the lights had all overloaded the circuit, and the lights went off. That man repeated from memory the rest of that chapter out of John 14 until the lights came back on. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face.
Wow.
But that had such a calming effect on the whole situation. It's as if the Lord was saying, enough, let's focus on what we need to focus on. So when I tell my story, I tell it to honor the memory of those lives that were lost. I tell it to support those survivors that were left behind and struggled for years and years with those losses. So it's in their memory and their honor. My part of what I did, I felt like, was just a small thing. I'm sure there are other parts I'm leaving out. What really amazed me, Jeremy, was how everyone pulled together. We were a small community, less than half the population that we are today. But so everybody knew everybody, and in a small community, you talk about each other, you fuss at each other, and that didn't matter. It absolutely did not matter. We were flooded with people from the community who came in and did the most horrendous, horrible, heroic things to help somebody else that needed it. It didn't matter who you were. They just pulled together, and that makes you appreciate and love your community. I told some ladies up front this morning, it kind of vulcanizes you to the community. You think, this is where I belong, this is where I need to be, where people will help each other. My philosophy in life is, if we're not here to help each other, I don't know why we're here.
Isn't that the truth?
Now, my wife, we talked about this interview coming up, and my wife said, are you going to talk to him? And I said, sure. I said, I don't mind telling my story, but this time of year, it seems like I tell it 50 times. And I'm the guy that goes home and has nightmares about it. So you do it to honor and the memory of all those that were lost, and to try to support and express your love for those that were left behind.
Yeah.
This is so. I moved to Texas, for 16 years, and when it was time to, our son died, and then 11 years later, his mother died unexpectedly. So when it was time to go somewhere else after a year, I came back here.
Gotcha.
I just felt like this was home.
Well, we're really glad you did.
Well,
and we're really glad you're sharing your story with us.
Yeah. People need to be prepared. Have a plan. Have a plan in your house of what you're going to do in case there is a tornado. Where I grew up, tornadoes were so prevalent that we would have drills. We would have fire drills. We would have tornado drills.
You from Texas?
No, from Monticello, Indiana.
Oh, you said that.
Yeah, out there in the country.
Sorry.
And we were on the second floor of an old farmhouse, and there was one of these big antenna towers right by our bedroom window, and our drill was, I was the oldest child, my drill was to open the window and make sure that my siblings climbed down that triangular looking, almost a ladder-like tower to get to the ground. But we had a plan, and we had supplies in the basement. We had root cellars we would go in. I can remember my dad going in and clearing the potatoes off a shelf and putting blankets up there for us to lay on the shelf to sleep while he sat over listening to a radio with a kerosene lantern, and or we were playing checkers or whatever we were doing. But we practiced our plan and often had to execute our plan.
Yeah. Now, had you seen a tornado during your time in Monticello?
Oh yeah. One went through Delphi when I was probably 4, 5, 6 years old, and took all the windows out of the house and destroyed our barns. And I know we were in the basement. I can remember looking out the window at a plant in all the darkness, and that's about all I remember of that one. But I had seen some others doing farm work on a tractor, and be, you know, a scattered storm day, and here comes a storm, and I watched it, and was with my dad one time in a pickup truck, and he sold cattle feed and supplement, and we were going somewhere, and we looked out, and I said, "Dad, there's a tractor and a cultivator out there, and I don't see anybody on it." And he said, "Well, you better look over here." And here was a funnel cloud, and we stopped, and I said, "Why are you stopping?" He said, "We're going to figure out which way that's moving, and then we're going to go at a right angle away from it. We're not going to try to run away from it. We're going to go at a right angle away from it." And I thought about that tractor and that out there in the field just with nobody on it. A couple of days later, I went with him, and we were at this little truck stop restaurant kind of thing out in Round Grove, Indiana. And here was this little old man drinking coffee with my dad. And I said, I don't remember his name. And I said, "Mr. So-and-so, I saw your tractor out in the field when that tornado was coming." And he says, "Yes." He said, "I put the cultivator as far in the ground as I could, and I got under the tractor and hung on to the cultivator while the tornado went past."
Wow.
Yeah.
Smart.
So those things get planted in your mind. You know, be prepared.
Right.
Have a plan.
How did those tornadoes that you witnessed as a child, how did that compare to the beast you saw on April 3rd?
The beast wasn't even recognizable hardly as a tornado. It was just a big wall of black. But the ones as a child were minor. As much damage as they caused, they were minor compared to what happened April 3rd, 74.
It seems like in many ways Brandenburg turned out to be the epicenter. Brandenburg and Xenia, the
Xenia,
epicenter
Ohio.
of what occurred that day. As a student of meteorology, I'm always blown away when I think about just the statistical improbability of such occurrences that occurred that day, and yet they...
How many were there that day? The Reader's Digest had an article of like 99 tornadoes in a single day, and I don't know if that was accurate.
148.
148.
148 tornadoes that occurred in less than 24 hours. At the time, that was never seen anything like that. But it wasn't just the number of tornadoes. It was the magnitude of the tornadoes. And you guys saw one of the worst of the worst. To put it in perspective, the F5, the rarity of the F5, or the EF5 now, occurs less than once per year across the entire United States. Sometimes you'll have many years that goes by without seeing one occurrence of an F5 or EF5. In fact, currently, you have to go back to 2013 since the last EF5 happened in Moore, Oklahoma, 11 years ago. On that day, there were 7. 7 F5s. And then on that day, and we remember how bad Henryville was. Just a few years ago, in 2012, Henryville's really bad storm.
Yeah.
That was an F4. People talk about that, we'll talk about that for decades. That one storm, which was an F4. On that day, there was 23 F4s, the strength of Henryville, and then 7, a whole nother level. And I got to read some of the findings from Dr. Fujita, which is the famous Japanese professor of meteorology out of the University of Chicago, that did surveys for the entire 148 tornadoes that occurred that day. And what he described to happen in Brandenburg, he said that is the top of the scale. He'd never seen damage at that level before. He said if there was a theoretical F6, based on some of the damage that occurred on top of West Hill, it would be right there.
It was beyond description. It was beyond description. I grew up on a farm, and you see things destroyed, or you come across things that have been destroyed, and you, in your mind, you wonder, what did that used to look like? But, as she said, you couldn't tell what street you were on. You couldn't get your bearings. You couldn't figure out where you were or whose house you were next to. It was that horrific and complete devastation.
Obviously, it changed this town forever.
Yeah.
What's the legacy of April 3rd, 1974 for Brandenburg?
We're survivors. I speak for a lot of people who don't feel comfortable speaking because of what they still carry, the pain they still carry in their hearts because of that day. But we are survivors. We are people who will work together, and we will support each other and love each other. We may fuss and argue and correct each other and reprimand each other, but we will come together and show our true spirit. You can't beat the people here.
It's fantastic. Tom, any final thoughts?
Just sometimes you feel guilty because you are a survivor, but like I say, if we're not here to help each other, I don't know why we're here.
That's great. We'll leave it right there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you.
That was really great. You can tell he's told that story